Hi everyone, welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, the 16th of February, where we are getting close to finishing up most of the major sections of the text so that we can move into the performance aspect of the course. And that means your first speech, which is an autobiographical speech, as we've discussed before, 5 minutes, where you can tell the audience a little bit about yourself, whether you give a holistic overview or you decide to focus on a particular element of your life or a particular time period. And I usually suggest if you can't decide what to discuss, you may want to ultimately discuss something such as education, which is something that we all share in one way or another, or else we wouldn't be in this class. So I wanted to talk about delivering speeches, I wanted to talk about culture, and I also wanted to talk about audience. So for delivering speeches, which is in chapter 10, we are focusing on what's known as the extemporaneous speech, a speech that's prepared in advance and delivered with a speaking outline. And as I had indicated, less is more in the speaking outline. You want just keywords and phrases. You want to be able to speak with your audience, or in this instance, the camera, maintain eye contact, and only refer to your notes when necessary, if necessary. And certainly, if you've got too much text, it would be too difficult for you to maintain eye contact. And you don't want two sets of speaking notes, one that you submit into me and one that you actually use. What I want are the actual speaking notes that you yourself use so that I can give you my suggestions on ways that you could perhaps improve them. But of course, speaking notes are very individual, so part of this class is you're trying to find the technique that's most useful to you. I'm going to ask that you submit in those speaking notes to me via email when you actually post your speech onto Moodle. So that will be coming up in the next couple weeks. In the real world, no one would see your speaking notes but yourself, but since this is a kind of workshop situation, I wanted to be able to take a peek and to give you my suggestions. Now, there are other kinds of speeches that can be delivered. There is such a thing as an impromptu speech, which is delivered a spur in the moment with no prior preparation. Usually, it's a surprise for the speaker, so they don't have time to prepare anything. For instance, being given an award that you weren't expecting. My suggestion is to keep it short and sweet if you're ever in that situation, because the longer you speak, the more likely it is that you can become entangled in your speaking. And the last thing you want to do is embarrass yourself. So sometimes a thank you is more than enough. And the manuscript speech is a speech that is read literally from a manuscript or from a teleprompter, usually in highly formal events where there's little or no room for error. While you might be thinking that that also includes our public speaking class, it does not. I'm talking about things like televised broadcasts where you have to time things to the second. I'm talking about things like presidential addresses where a misstatement could actually cause a war. And I've never spoken with a teleprompter. I do know that there are some conventions for a manuscript speech. For instance, when you're presenting at a conference, oftentimes you read a paper, literally, you're reading your original research. But that's not the kind of public speaking that we're talking about. And even if you do have access to a teleprompter, it requires some level of skill to make it appear like you are naturally communicating, even though you're reading off of a screen. And there's still the possibility of technological failure. In fact, if you'll notice in the notes below under delivering speeches number 1, there is a brief video, a couple minutes long, with a teleprompter fail that I wanted you to see. And it's with Michael Bay, very famous Hollywood director, talking about one of his newest movies. Obviously, he's very conversant with the subject matter, but his teleprompter fails, and, well, you see what happens. He basically panics and runs off stage. Not that he doesn't know what to talk about, this is his profession, but he just wasn't prepared for not having that security blanket, if you will. So I always use this as an example that even what would seem to be ideal, a teleprompter, comes with its own challenges. There is such a thing as a memorized speech. It's usually very brief, and it's usually for very formal events. Things like, let's say, the toast at a wedding. Again, you don't want to be memorizing our speeches, much like the Toastmaster video I talked about, because it'll sound stilted, and if you forget a piece, then you're likely to lose your way. So, thinking about the actual delivery, you want to think about your voice because it's more than just content, which is what we were talking about last class. You want to be conversational. You want to vary your volume, your speed, and your inflections. You want to enunciate, so you don't want to mumble. That's different than pronunciation. And pronunciation can be regional, it can also be national. And that said, I don't think you're going to be able to alter your pronunciation over a short period of time. That's something that usually takes months, if not years. But you don't need to, as long as your audience understands what it is that you are saying. And if you feel self-conscious because, let's say, your first or your native language is not English and your pronunciation is something that you're concerned about, you can even give a kind of disclaimer at the beginning of your speech that if someone's having difficulty understanding you, to let you know, or that English is not your first language, so you're going to speak a little bit more slowly so that hopefully the audience can understand you. The advantage of doing that is that the burden now of understanding has been placed on the audience. It's not necessarily placed on you to pronounce things in an accurate form. And even think about how sometimes there's dispute about how to pronounce things. So I always am challenged by the term Bernardston or Berniston because I'm not a native of this area. It's just a question of putting the accent in the wrong place. And if you're familiar with Romance languages, they actually use accent marks in their spelling to give you a sense as to where you're supposed to put the accent. But then there are other words as well that we haven't really reached consensus with. Is it Caribbean or Caribbean? Again, the accent is placed in a different area. Is it harassment or harassment? Again, the accent in a different area. But that's quite different than enunciating because you're mumbling, nobody can hear you. My apologies for the phone that's ringing now. That is one of the disadvantages, perhaps, for recording live. But at any rate, you want to avoid mumbling. And also, you want to make sure that you can pause effectively for effect. So that said, I know that's one of my bigger challenges is that I oftentimes speak very quickly. It's the New Yorker in me. So sometimes just taking a quiet pause, as I had suggested in many of your responses about nervousness, if you are concerned about, let's say, ahs and ums, sometimes just taking a quiet breath in place of an ah and an is perfectly sufficient, and that would reduce the number of ums and ahs that you are likely stating in your speech. A lot of times people will say an or an ah, mostly because they're trying to get oxygen into their lungs. Also, they're trying to think of what to say next. And of course, if you had a speaking outline and you did preparation ahead of time, that wouldn't be an issue. So there is such a thing called proxemics. It's the use of space, and this is a discipline in and of itself. It very much can influence how an audience responds to a speech. Think about something like even the furniture arrangement in a classroom, whether it be rows or whether it be tables. Or something like personal space, where we usually have a certain comfort level between ourselves and another individual. Usually, the more intimate the relationship, the less personal space needed. That said, when you are thinking about something like personal space, you might have seen what I call the dance. These are two people who have very different definitions of what's comfortable for personal space. One person needs more, one person needs less, and you see them continually, one person stepping forward so they can decrease the personal space between them, and then the other person responding by stepping backwards so they can increase the personal space between them, and they literally move around the room doing that. They're both uncomfortable and they don't know why. Now, this is probably going to be less of an issue as you are thinking about recording, but you do want to think about things like your environment. And you also want to consider affect display. These are facial expressions. This is usually how we determine meaning, especially if we're going to be recording something. People are going to be focusing on your face. You have the decision to make whether or not you want to do a full body shot or partial body shot, but you do want to make sure that regardless of how you record yourself, that we are getting a good view of your face and your facial expressions. In fact, it's been shown that individuals who have great difficulty with social relationships, and I'm talking about such difficulty that they can't function on a day-to-day basis, they've been shown pictures of facial expressions which are usually quite universal, that a smile denotes happiness, for instance, or a frown denotes unhappiness. And they've misidentified these pictures, that they've identified a smile as unhappiness or a frown as happiness. It would explain why they would have difficulty with social relationships if they are misreading social cues. So gesturing, that's also something to consider, and it may be hampered somewhat by the use of video, depending on what kind of view the camera is going to be giving us. But I do want you to consider gestures, that oftentimes gestures are used to convey meaning. You can have a conventional gesture, which is a gesture that basically has been assigned meaning through custom. Let's say something like a thumbs up, meaning that something is good, for instance. It doesn't have to have that meaning. And in fact, it might have meanings in different cultures. For instance, the OK sign that we think of in the United States is actually a sign of vulgarity in countries like Brazil, which can indicate that why there might be cultural misunderstanding if you've got two different people using gestures that they assign completely different meanings to. There are descriptive gestures. Those are easier to understand because they're usually universal. They describe things like size and shape. So for instance, I might show you the length or the height of something. And then there are indicators that can express feelings. For instance, slamming a fist on a table to indicate anger or to reinforce a point. Again, it's going to depend on your camera angle, what kinds of gestures, if any, that we are going to be seeing. But you don't want to appear stiff. You don't want to be rocking in your chair, things of that nature, if you are sitting in a chair. Which you wouldn't do during a live presentation because we would want you to stand so that we could see. But of course, with the camera, I'm sitting, for instance, but the focus is on my face. In other words, the affect display is something that, and eye contact is something that is of importance. And usually we want to vary our eye contact across an audience so that it appears that we are paying attention to them. And if you feel somewhat hesitant doing that, I suggest looking at the tops of heads or even the two corners of the room and also the center. By doing so, you'll give the illusion of eye contact. Again, things are going to seem different when you are presenting to a camera because the camera is your audience. So you want to be looking straight into the camera so that we can see your eyes when we are watching the video. And keep in mind, this is not a class in video editing. This is a class in speech delivery. So you're not going to be splicing together lots of different pieces of video to end up with the perfect speech. There is no such thing as the perfect speech. You want to be comfortable enough speaking to the camera. So when you are in a situation where you have to speak to a camera, whether you be on Zoom or you are recording, that you can do so. And in our increasingly technologically reliant world, that's becoming a more and more of an important skill. So culture, I also wanted to touch upon as well. And culture is, I suppose, in the broadest definition of the word, any group membership. So a culture usually we think of as these rather large groups, things based on, let's say, age or gender or ethnicity. But cultures can be much smaller and much more specific. I suppose we could debate whether or not a pair, two people, could be considered a group, but certainly three or more could. And the idea of a culture is that there are certain universalities that are shared. So our class, for better or worse, is a culture, because we are a group of individuals who share certain behaviors and attitudes and values. And that said, while there's a predictive element, we also want to avoid stereotyping, assuming that everybody is the same in that cultural group. But again, there is a certain predictive element. If you've ever been in a face to face class, for instance, you know that certain groups, certain classes, they form their own personalities. Some are more quiet, some are more vocal. And again, I can make some generalizations about, let's say, the cultural group of college students that usually, they don't have a lot of time. And usually they don't have a lot of money either. And usually they're going to be informally dressed. Yeah, so I can get a sense of their behavior. Um, and usually they think that tuition is too high. So that's a behavior, or not a behavior, I'm sorry, an attitude. Um, and usually they think education is a good, or else they wouldn't be involved in college. So that's a value. Not necessarily everybody feels that way, but I suspect the majority does. So if we're thinking about group membership, whether it's a very specialized group or something that's much, much broader, you do want to think about how that culture could influence, doesn't always influence, but it could influence behaviors. Those are usually easier to determine because those are actions that are visible. And this can include conversational style, how much you speak, and also whether or not you're direct or indirect in the way that you approach subjects. The West, in other words, the United States, is usually viewed as a pretty direct culture. There are other cultures, Asian cultures, for instance, that are more indirect, that they do a lot of storytelling before they actually get to the point. One cultural style is not necessarily better than another for conversation, it's just different. And if you've got two people from two different conversational styles, then of course there's a greater chance of misunderstanding or frustration between them. I always think of a former colleague of mine, Dovia Fessi, who used to teach history, and he's originally from Africa. And he would talk about some of the cultural differences between his country and the United States. And one story that's always stayed with me was about bus schedules. And he had talked about that in the United States, the bus leaves at a particular time, let's say 3:12, because it needs to be at another location at a specific time, let's say 3:27. And it doesn't matter whether the bus is full or empty. This It needs to do that, and this makes perfect sense to us, because we're on a schedule. And he says that in Africa, it's ridiculous that an empty bus would leave just because it's time to leave. That the bus would leave when it's full, regardless of the time. And this is a very difficult concept for Americans to understand because, of course, the question is, well, what's going to happen with the schedule to the bus? And the response is the bus will eventually arrive. It's not a question of it not arriving. But of course, people say, well, we've got obligations. I need to be at class at a certain time, or I need to be at work at a certain time. And the response from him would be, you're still going to get there. Work isn't disappearing, class isn't disappearing. And the idea is that class begins when everyone's present and it ends when class is done, which means that class could be 5 minutes long or 5 hours long. It's a completely different way of seeing time, which seems to be quite objective, but it really is subjective. And think about how we consider time. We talk about wasting time as opposed to the idea that time is supposed to serve us. We serve time. It's not that one philosophy about time is better than another, it's just different. And it definitely influences things like behaviors, in this instance, bus schedule. Attitudes, feelings, which can change and vary, sometimes moment by moment. And attitudes are usually, if anybody's told you you have a bad attitude, then you understand what I'm talking about. Attitudes are usually influenced by things like beliefs, things that we think are true or false, and also values. And values are firmly embedded within us. They are highly resistant to change. This is going to be something that will be particularly important when we talk about the persuasive speech, because that's the speech that perhaps might challenge someone's beliefs and their values. I would say that values incorporate behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs. So it's all of them together in that respect. And I mentioned culture and the fact of multiculturalism, many cultures, because you're going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of different kinds of cultural memberships in your audience. There will be the big demographic groups. Those are the observable characteristics of individuals. And we usually think about things like age and gender and ethnicity, religion, a political affiliation. But again, it can be much, much more specialized. And you just want to be aware of the individuals who are in your audience and try to adapt to your audience. You want to be audience centered, not that you are standing in the center of the audience, but you want to consider the needs and the expectations of the audience and adapt accordingly, within reason, of course. And that said, when we think about, the demographics of an audience, we're not going to be able to appeal to every demographic group. But certainly, if you're speaking to, let's say, a group of children, your presentation is likely to be quite different than if you were speaking to another demographic group, let's say a group of adults. Obviously, you use simpler vocabulary. And there might be topics that you might not feel comfortable with discussing with the younger children that you would feel comfortable with speaking with older adults. And one thing I can guarantee is that in our class, we are adults. And regardless of age, if you're enrolled in a college class, you are treated as if you are an adult. So, one of the things that the text talks about that I don't believe would ever be an issue with any of you is what happens if you have to present to a hostile audience. Again, it's very unlikely you would ever be in that situation. Usually, you know full well when you're going into a situation where you're going to be presenting to a hostile audience. For instance, you are presenting to a different political group. Let's say if you happen to be campaigning. But that said, you might have a skeptical audience, let's say, in your persuasive speech. So, some suggestions. I don't have necessarily a magic bullet for you, but establishing goodwill. The idea is that we all want what's best. There is no ill intent. Establishing areas of agreement, that there might be places where we disagree, but there are also places where we can agree. Using credible outside sources. It's one of the reasons why for your last speech I'm going to ask you to use outside sources, because that gives a certain level of credibility to your presentation. Being professional. So I've oftentimes said with the persuasive speech, the goal is not to convince everybody of your position. That's an impossibility. I don't even think it's healthy. I think disagreement can oftentimes be very good. That said, what you want from your audience is to earn their respect. They may not agree with your position, but they respect your position and they respect your presentation, even more importantly. You can use humor. That can oftentimes diffuse tension, but understand that humor is oftentimes very individual and oftentimes culturally based as well. So what might be funny to one group or one person may not necessarily be funny. In fact, it might even be offensive to another cultural group or another person. And be multi-sided, or what I call, avoiding the elephant in the room is not terribly helpful to you. In that if there are obvious counter arguments or ultimately, if you know that your audience is going to be skeptical for a particular reason, you may as well just address that rather than pretend that it doesn't exist, the elephant in the room. Sometimes people just want to be heard and acknowledged. They don't even want you necessarily to agree with them. They just want you to acknowledge that there's another viewpoint or there's another way of seeing the world. Now, I had indicated that I wanted you to watch some sample autobiographical speeches done by students like yourselves, in no way affiliated with GCC, so you don't have to worry that one day one of your recorded speeches will be examined in one of my classes. But these were speeches that were uploaded to YouTube, so I'm assuming that they are available for public consumption. And there are three speeches. This is going to be your attendance question for today because I wanted you to watch all three of these speeches and talk about a strength and a weakness of each of these three speeches. The first speech is a speech delivered in a military setting. I did that very deliberately because we've been talking about culture, and definitely the military is a culture in and of itself with its own behaviors, beliefs, attitudes, and values. The second speech happens to be a speech that it looks like it was done in a home, and it looks like it was done as an assignment for an online class. Again, I don't know details. And then the third speech was filmed, actually delivered in a classroom. And while we can't necessarily evaluate these speeches on all of the criteria that we are evaluating our first speech on, in other words, length, you have 5 minutes, and I don't know how long these speakers had, and certainly we can't evaluate them on the 5 minute mark. But what we can evaluate are introductions and bodies and conclusions, and we can evaluate transitions and presentations and volume and facial expressions, all of those elements. So each of these speeches will perhaps also give you some ideas of ways that you could proceed with your own autobiographical speech, since all three of these students go about it in very different ways. Not that you have to in any way follow them. But what that would leave us with is that next class we get to have a quiz, and that'll be on some of the earlier sets of readings that we've discussed and the class videos as well. 20 questions, mostly short answers, some multiple choice and true false, and open book, open notes. So basically, so if you've been reading the textbook and watching the class videos, the quiz should be very manageable. This is some incentive perhaps for you to do the reading and watch the videos, but also I'm hopeful that the questions that I ask on the quiz are questions that will be useful to you when you are putting together your own speech. Next week is also when I'm going to be asking you to contact me for your practice session. As I had indicated that I want to have contact with each of you before each of the three graded speeches that you are delivering. So that said, you can make it as detailed or as general as you'd like. The contact could just be a quick email to me telling me how things are going with your speech, whether or not you have any questions or concerns and what you're planning on discussing. So it could just be a few sentences long. Or you might ask to meet with me, let's say via Zoom, so that you could actually present a draft of your speech to me so that I can give you feedback or anything in between. Again, I'll talk about this a little bit more next class. And then the week after that is when we actually present our first speech. But I will leave you now to watch these three sample student speeches and for a class attendance question to indicate a strength and a weakness for all three of these speeches. This will be due on Saturday at 6 p.m. Most certainly, if you need an extension, please let me know. That's Saturday the 18th at 6 p.m., where you are asked to list one strength and one weakness from each of the sample autobiographical speeches. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we'll continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.